May I congratulate the University of Western Australia for the In the Zone conference. This is the fourth iteration of that conference, and I think it's played a very important role in forging our links into Asia, particularly in this session I context China, but also raising an awareness within Asia of Western Australia and our strengths and maybe even our weaknesses. In the Zone has started off with a very clever concept that the time zone includes some 2 billion people and places Perth in that zone with the major cities of Asia and indeed the fastest growing of the world, part of the world. The West Australian economy is very different than the Australian economy as a whole. It's a point I tend to labour on a little bit, but it is not well understood and its implications are not well understood at a national level. For a start, Western Australia and Perth is more distant from the rest of Australia, Perth being second only to Honolulu as the most isolated capital city. Our economy is different. It is highly specialised. 60% of mineral production for Australia comes from this state, 75% of petroleum production for Australia comes from this state. So it's a highly specialised, highly concentrated in mining, petroleum and agriculture. Western Australia is also obviously very export orientated. The domestic Australian market is relatively unimportant to Western Australia, whereas for the East Coast it is highly important. Western Australia therefore does dominate in Australia's exports, and I'm sure those figures have been quoted before, but I'll do it one more time because I can't resist it. The fact that Western Australia accounts for 46% of national exports when the population of the state is only 10% of the national figure is quite extraordinary. That 46% figure will exceed 50% by the end of this decade and may well approach 60% in the following decade. So we are going to become more specialised and more integrated within Asia. And I think Western Australia is ahead of the rest of the nation in our relationships with individual Asian economies. If you go back to the start, I guess, of the Asian adventure in the 1960s, that was very much built about iron ore development in the Pilbara and then natural gas, very much tied to the Japanese economy, the post-war reconstruction of Japan, Japan's need for iron ore for its steel industry, Japan's need for natural gas for its energy sector. And Western Australia obviously was at the forefront of that and therefore at the forefront of the relationship with Japan. A relationship, I must say, that was thought out carefully in advance by governments and industry both in Japan and in Australia. Bear in mind, only 15 years after the end of the Second World War. So it was a great political achievement, I think, both within Australia and Japan, particularly in Australia between the Menzies government and the David Brand Charles Court governments to actually achieve and to convince a population that it was in our national interest, in our state interest, to have that alignment with Japan. Perhaps as China came on the scene rapidly from the mid-90s, there wasn't that attention into building the relationship and the understanding at a government level. With the relationship with Japan, it was very much about Japanese steel mills, trading enterprises like Mitsui and Mitsubishi and others, energy companies, both gas and electricity, buying small, stable shares in big projects with quality Australian and international partners. That didn't happen so much with the emergence of China. China was more of a rush to take full control, full ownership of often small Australian companies, or relatively small, and often holding small and often isolated natural resources. And I guess the Midwest magnetite industry would be an example of that. Nevertheless, over the last 10 years or so, that relationship with China is maturing. But there was quite a contrast. But again, also the fact that Western Australia has very much led the relationship with China, just as it led the relationship from an Australian context with Japan. And even though now China has become the state's #1 trading partner, Western Australia providing some 73% of all exports to China, this state also supplies 45% of Australia's exports to Japan, so that the sort of dominant relationship is still there. I guess the other measure of the maturity of the relationship with China is that 80% of state-owned enterprise investment in Australia is actually into Western Australia. So a dominant investment relationship with the state-owned enterprises mainly, and also in terms of exports. Now, there's been a lot of debate about particularly China and Chinese investment, ownership of agricultural land and the like. I am now old enough to have a perspective on history, and I can assure you when I was a small boy, my father, who was a World War II veteran, said to me he was alarmed that America had saved Australia, but America was going to take us over, and that was a risk. Then, of course, we had in the 1960s that we'd be taken over by Japan, and we were hesitant about that. Now we're having the same sense about China. And I think in that context, Western Australia has been more exposed, more integrated with Asia, and has a greater level of maturity and understanding of the Asian relationship. And that particularly came home to me over the last couple of days. I spent Friday and Saturday in Kununurra. Now, one of the great dreams of Australian development is developing the north and developing agricultural industry. When Prime Minister Billy McMahon opened the first stage of the Ord River project in 1972, he said stage 2 will just follow on immediately. Well, it took 40 years, but it did follow on, and on Friday we opened the second stage, let water gush down this 31-kilometre channel about as wide as Winthrop Hall. Spectacular sight. But wasn't it interesting? The stage 2 that took 40 years, funded by the West Australian government in terms of the economic infrastructure, the social infrastructure in terms of housing, education and health improvements, funded by the federal government, a rare and successful partnership. The development of another 13,500 hectares of land and a $700 million investment into a sugar industry by a Shanghai-based private business. And Aboriginal people totally involved in the project, about 100 jobs in construction, allocated land and other benefits. And I thought it was a strange sight. A little comment on where we are to see Mr. Wu from Shanghai Zhongfu shaking hands and embracing local Aboriginal people as this Australian project went ahead. And I think that's a sign of how the relationships are spreading and have matured. When I was returning on the plane coming back, and it is a long way, Perth to Kununurra is the same as London to Moscow. So I thought I needed to pass the time, and hopefully the time would go quicker. So I admit to not having read in full, but I decided I would read the recent white paper on Australia in the Asian century. I was disappointed. It didn't make the time go quicker. It made it drag out. And I want to tell you why. I found that document on our relationship with Asia to be underwhelming. I also found it to be lacking in analysis and lacking in objectivity. And I just want to make a couple of comments about it. I won't dwell on the objectivity point, but if you read the introductory chapters, you will see fulsome praise for the Chifley government and for the Whitlam government. I don't take away any of their achievements, but I did find it odd that the 2 decades of the Menzies era was basically washed out of history as though it never happened. And yet that was the time the relationship with Southeast Asia and the relationship with Japan was forged. However, I got over that and kept reading. Then by about page 150, about 2/3 of the way through, the terms of expression change. Suddenly the objectivity has gone, and the text, if you read it, talks about what we are doing and our achievements. And I'm thinking, well, hang on, who's the we here? It doesn't take much to realise that the second half of it is basically recycled press releases and ministerial statements from the Rudd and Gillard governments. I mean, it's a pity, because the first half of it was actually a pretty good assessment. Now, I'm not totally critical. I mean, it does provide, I think, a good snapshot of Asian growth and how that relates to Australia. And points that are made are important. That, for example, I mean, it's just educational, that Asia's output, production will be about half of the world total by 2025. It makes the point that productivity growth in the Asian countries, including the developing nations, is very quickly catching up to the Western developed economies. It makes the point that in many countries, including China, consumption levels are low by Western standards. So in other words, as incomes rise, consumption will be a stronger driving force of our economy. And we should always remember that consumer spending, 60% plus, is the dominant force of any economy. It does stress the urbanisation and the growth, I guess, of the city-states of Asia, such as Singapore, Shanghai, Tokyo and others, that have an economy that almost drives it by itself and almost independent of the host nation. And the fact that around 44 million people across Asia are moving into cities in any one year is an extraordinary factor. Another point that I think is relevant is the fact that the countries of Asia now hold about half of the foreign exchange reserves of the planet, and indeed have become major overseas investors, major providers of financial capital into the rest of the world. And of course food security, a looming issue for this century, where for China alone, probably the region, there will need to be something like a 70% increase in food supply by the middle of this century, in an environment where water is short, where environmental pollution is a problem, where much land is now marginalised for agricultural produce. So all of that is okay. So I want to be fair. I think all of that's useful information, not earth-shattering, not unique, but put together. What I found disappointing, and therefore what affects the way I think we might think about Asia, the document, in my view, was somewhat patronising. It was a bit of a them and us. I don't know how it would be read or interpreted in many of the Asian countries, but I thought it was patronising and a little bit simplistic. I think there are a number of significant omissions in matters that do affect our relationship with Asia, and particularly with China. Productivity was talked about, but the elephant in the room, which has been raised in this conference already, was that industrial relations was totally ignored. I mean, how can you talk about productivity and Asia catching up to Australian productivity and not comment on industrial relations and some of the issues there? Structural change in Australia was largely omitted, and yet the growth of Asia, and China in particular, is bringing enormous structural change to Australia, not least of which has been the ascendancy or rise, if you like, of Western Australia. And our dominance now in economic growth, our dominance in employment growth. While Australia as a whole struggles along a bit, this state last year grew at 7%. In that year, 44,000 new jobs in Western Australia compared to an overall loss of 36,000 jobs across the rest of Australia. So virtually all full-time employment growth has been in this state. It tends to downplay mining, as though, here we go again, mining, booms and busts, old economy, something to ignore. And yet our international trade and our exports for the nation as a whole is dominated by mining exports. And much of what is counted as manufacturing is very moderate transformations of raw materials. If you include some of those things in, like alumina, it's not bauxite, so alumina is transformed, but it's basically a raw material. It talks a lot about Australia's future lying in the services sector. I don't discount that. Services growth, obviously education, here we are at a university, health services, tourism, professional and business services, all important. But they are also very transferable, very open to competition from anywhere in the world. And also, we should not lose sight of the fact that services trade, while it is growing, is still less than 20% of total international trade. Commodity and merchandise and manufactured trade dominates and dominates in Asia. The paper talks about Australia's stability and its reliability. Well, yes, that's been our history, but we've had two big hiccups in the last couple of years that were ignored. The mineral resource rent tax, and I won't go into the pros and cons of that, but that did absolutely nothing for our relationship with Asia. And for the first time in my 20 years in public life, the term sovereign risk was used in an Australian context by both business and political leaders throughout Asia, including China. That was not good management of our relationship at all. And again, while there might have been good grounds on terms of animal welfare, the unilateral, abrupt cutting off of live cattle exports to Indonesia has damaged our reputation as a reliable supplier of food. And you might think that's a bit trivial, but I assure you, as a major agricultural producing state, it has had an impact. And indeed, the current problems that we saw in Bahrain with sheep were probably as much related back to that episode over cattle in similar Islamic country. I find it curious that Darwin, now I like Darwin, I've got nothing against Darwin, but Darwin, in fact the whole Northern Territory, has a population about the size of the city of Stirling in the Perth metropolitan area. Now, the paper identifies Darwin as our gateway to Asia and as a potential world-leading centre in manufacturing, in various technologies, in education, in health and so on. Now, Darwin does have a good future, and its future is around the Indonesian archipelago, East Malaysia, maybe even the Philippines. A big enough opportunity for Darwin and the Northern Territory. But to suggest that Darwin is going to be a world-leading centre, including finance, is just not realistic. I mean, where in the hell did that recommendation come from? It just does not make sense. And I know you might think I'm going to be parochial and say Perth's that centre. Well, I might. But increasingly, interestingly enough, for the West Australian resources industry, Singapore is increasingly becoming the business centre. And jobs are leaving Sydney and particularly Melbourne in professional, in banking, in legal matters, all sorts of professional services, and indeed from Perth. Much of the commercial and contracting, insurance and financing and legal services around the mining and resources industry is now coming out of Singapore. So Perth will have its share, we do. Singapore will. I don't think Darwin will to that extent. Sorry to my good friend Terry Mills, who's new Chief Minister. And finally, on taxes, it talks about the need to improve Australia's tax system. Well, every country's got to continually improve the internal operation of its economy. It praises the MRRT, and we've had a bit of discussion lately about the MRRT, and I know there's some economic students here, and I understand they understand the difference between sort of lump sum or profits-based taxes versus production taxes, but why would you design a tax like the MRRT and treat state royalties, which is the price at which the mineral is sold, to treat state royalties as prepaid MRRT tax, rather than simply treat it as a cost of production, which it is? I mean, that fails Economics 1.0. And, I hope the students think about that. I'm sure they're ahead of me. The paper also ignores the greatest imbalance, and that's the distribution of finances between governments in Australia. And, I'm not going to bang on about the GST issue, but we have a system in Australia which is actually taking revenues away from the growth parts of the Australian economy and the growth regions and distributing it to low growth areas. I mean, that is not an internal structural issue you would want to be in that form if you're going to be part of the Asian century. So there are critiques. To conclude, because I've probably spoken too long, for Western Australia, I admit the policy prescription is easier. We have a specialised economy. We are 20 years ahead of the rest of Australia in our relationship with Asia, which is a far more mature and a far more respectful relationship than I think reflected in the white paper. This state will continue to grow and broaden around its economic strengths, and there's opportunities. Chinese investment into the Ord River is an example, going beyond mining and petroleum into that. You will see more investment in more value-adding industries. The magnetite iron ore industry, low-grade iron ore, 35% compared to the 60% in the Pilbara, but upgraded to above Pilbara grades. Basically, again, moving into sort of a high value-added, almost getting close to a manufacturing phase. In conclusion, though, and I guess I have spoken too long, so I will stop, but the point I'd like to leave you with is that the white paper, and indeed much of the commentary that comes out of Canberra and the East Coast, fails to recognise that it's not a matter of a two-speed economy in Australia, that one state is going quicker than the other. It is a matter of a fundamental structural difference. The structure of the West Australian economy is fundamentally different than that of the rest of the economy, and that point is missed. And in the state GDP, if you like, figures that came out the other day, makes the point. Average, or if you like, per capita income, GDP per capita for Australia is about $64,000. Very extremely high by international standards. GDP per capita for Western Australia is $102,000. It is only the tax havens like Monaco and Liechtenstein and a few places that actually have a figure that is higher. Now, a lot of that is repatriated profit, so it's not necessarily reflecting wage levels. But there is no doubt there is a substantial gap in income levels and prosperity between this state and the other states. That is not symptomatic of a two-speed economy. It is a structurally different economy. So we will charge ahead. We've seen pessimism over the last few months that the commodity boom is apparently over and it's all, dastardly future. Before prices dropped for iron ore and for a couple of other minerals around August, September, and they did drop, Western Australia had $167 billion worth of projects either in construction or committed. After this sort of flutter, we still have $167 billion worth of projects either committed or under construction. Western Australia understands the ride it takes with China is onwards and upwards, but it's jagged. And these little flutters, these bursts and slowdowns are part of the ride. But it is the ride we have to take, and I have absolutely no doubt this state is going to continue to grow strongly. There won't be 15% growth rates or 10%. It'll be in that range of 4 to 6%, and it will stay in that range for the next 10 or 20 years. China, fundamental. Japan, as important as it has always been. India, part of the future. Thanks very much.